And we are live.
Hey everyone, welcome to another community forum. During these fora, we often entertain questions that people ask us on Discord or they've asked us on previous streams. Sometimes we have so many questions that we can't even respond to all of them. Sometimes we don't get any questions. And then when we don't have any questions, we just kind of riff on things that we find to be interesting. We riff amongst ourselves in private. We never really like all get together and just riff on miscellaneous topics. So we've done this a few times in the past, though. It's been semi-staged. Like we've had some ideas in the like with some pretension. Like we've known we're going to discuss this, we're going to discuss that. This one is relatively non-staged. So I think we're just gonna riff about some things. So, um,
So maybe I can start by throwing a question because I
okay.
recently had a conversation on civilizational collapse. I don't want to talk about civilization collapse necessarily, but I think an important aspect of that conversation that I had, which I think is much more pertinent for this forum, is the
Mm,
following. So at some point, there's the natural dilemma of saying, oh, what do you value in this world? I mean, is it human life? Is it all biological life? Is it intelligence? Is it, whatever, beauty in some kind of universal sense or where, so there's that moment. And I sort of suggested the provocation that maybe the thing to value normally when you think of humans being sustainable, you think of them in an ecosystem and being more or less integrated in a system of flow of resources and so on. But then, and so you attribute value to biological mass, and biological mass is kind of a good metric of how stable you are and so on. But then I realized maybe we should be attributing a value to something like computational mass or cognitive mass in some sense, right? Like, and I don't really know how to distinguish these two. I think the boundary is quite blurry if you press me. But I think that's a provocation that actually a lot of people in the tech world would probably align in the latter, right? They would say, well, no, it's actually whatever you have to produce, higher cognitive function and computation is valuable, and we have to make sure that you know, that survives somehow. So I guess as that provocation, I can throw in this forum to for ourselves, like what do we see as valuable in this sense, right? Is it just biological mass? Is it whatever support for computation or cognition in some generalized sense? This kind of idea. I mean, it's extremely vague, but I think we can collapse it down to a more meaningful, juicy conversation from the provocation.
yeah, that's nice. That's great. Okay. Well, yeah, I have things to say, but I don't want to go first necessarily. Who who wants to?
Okay,
Uh,
someone go first. James then will spill the thoughts. By the way, there's just a question that's been posted, so we can riff on this for a bit and then
oh,
go
okay.
to. There's some question on mathematics and so on. So
Oh, okay, cool. Well, anyone want to talk about what they care about?
you care about nothing.
Oh, gee, come on, guys. Okay, fine. I mean, just as a problem. I mean, okay, this is not it's not an easy question, and
No.
it's almost it's a mm, I never like being in situations where you have to kind of indicate some preference of one thing at the expense of something else.
Mm.
So you have to say what is it that you care about, and then the response will be, oh, I care about this thing. I don't care about this thing as much. That always it's like, who are you to kind of carve up this world in terms of your own personal preferences or attachments. But I think if I understand kind of maybe what Carlos is alluding to, I mean, it's kind of funny because one kind of response you could give is that it is beautiful how humans especially when given the right resources and freedom and so on and so forth, that we are able to creatively do rather fantastic things. So that's a claim that you can make. Now, of course, you can say that it's easy to say as a human because we happen to be particularly fond admirers of our own works. And so, we happen to, maybe it's like a natural thing to say that, the arts and architecture and mathematics and science and things that humans create are particularly striking. And you admire those things, and you don't admire all kinds of other things that other creatures happen to create, or things that seem to be created without any kind of architect at all. So maybe Carlos's framing of like computation in general, Carlos, is the idea that mm, on the one hand you could admire things that humans happen to build and create, but you could also admire things that are being created just through concerts of processes, some of which might not even have any kind of agent behind them, like the formation of mountain ranges or something. It's not as though it's a human creation, but it's something that is the product of a process, and you could admire that too. Is that the idea? Is that the idea?
It is. It's very related to that, but I think it's a bit more refined in the sense that you
Mm,
want to somehow debate like what matters in the end. I mean, it's a very kind of philosophical, ethical, sort of wishy-washy kind of statement, but in the context of discussing civilizational collapse, like many things were said to be like bad or wrong, or in the context of sustainability and
mhm,
things like that, it's like, oh yeah, there's some metrics that were interesting. They mentioned that there was a how much was that, like 80% of the mammal mass on the planet, or 90% of the mammal mass on the planet, is either humans or domesticated animals. And there's been a shift in mammal mass in the last like 40 to 50 years that is like quite dramatic, and things like that, right? And so when you analyze that, it's like, okay, that's alarming in some sense, or that's kind of like,
yeah,
it's rapid
yeah,
in the time scales of evolution, but what is it that you value ultimately? Like, what is it that, I mean, this kind of conversation in the past was
yeah,
kind of a non-starter, and now we actually, because we don't have like a preferred value system, we
hmm,
have to actually debate those things. And what I was trying to, the provocation was,
yeah,
maybe there's an angle to say, if a system, a system being biological seems way too, I mean, it's kind of a good start of like, yeah, that's some kind of value, it's close to human. A system being exclusively human seems way too reductive. But
yeah,
something in between, I think, is something that could be, that is not just like literally everything alive or everything that's a process, because that's like, okay, everything. It's to say something like, if the process is doing some sort of cognition or some sort of computation,
hmm,
then, but not computation in a very general sense of processes coming together, but like actually some kind of informational dynamics that we as informational beings can somehow recognize, then maybe that's something to value. And then I gave some examples that I can give here to illustrate what I'm trying to say, which is, obviously civilization, human activity, that's one very glaring example, obviously. But there's things like, other species that have societies and some kind of behavior that is
hmm,
kind of social, but also things like complex forests and jungles that
hmm,
might have some
hmm,
kind of computational power. There is this wood wide web, if you've heard of it, like all this processing power of forests and things like that. Also colonies that have this sort of hive mind phenomenon that seem to be
hmm,
having some sort of sentience, some sort of agency that is definitely distributed, and things like that, right? So
yeah,
that's kind of what I'm thinking. And obviously AIs and things like this, and agents that are completely artificial and come into existence in other realms and other substrates and things like that. So to me, that's more of a more contemporary,
hmm,
more serious kind of like approach to the question of what is valuable. That it's otherwise you have to go back to what the Greeks were saying. It was equally authoritative with respect to what is biological mass, what is inert mass. I mean, they had a pretty good split of
hmm,
those already, and I
hmm,
think a more contemporary approach to this could bring in things like complexity, things like you know uh,
hmm,
maybe the C word, consciousness, whatever. But I think so that was kind of the provocation, is what do you actually value? I mean, is it, if you're going to be quantitative about it, eventually you have to make some choices, and these choices are currently not so spelled out in the debate on what's
hmm.
important, right?
Okay, okay, okay. Well, uh, I guess there are a few questions. One is kind of what do you value, but also what should you place an emphasis on because you think it will lead to actions that will help to promote the realization of outcomes that are consistent with your value system as well. So I'll make one kind of provocation, which is um, so we can obviously appreciate that there's complexity and sophisticated behavior and beauty, kind of active, dynamic beauty beyond just the Anthropocene, right? Um, so the question is, um, one question is, does that should that encourage us to think about policies or actions that kind of decenter the human, or is it really important to focus on humans themselves? And I'll make one kind of argument, which is, um, so like as I was saying before, you might think it's quite uh, it's kind of like an example of species chauvinism to place too much weight on human achievements. And so if even if you have some program where you're trying to advocate for basic human freedom, human creativity, etc., someone could turn around and say, okay, but if you're placing if you're kind of privileging human creativity and human freedom amongst those of other species, um, there's something too anthropocentric about that. But I'll issue one kind of provocation, which is one fear that I have is that if humans are fundamentally not free, I think it will ultimately be to the detriment not only of themselves, but probably of the greater planet overall. So humans do have the capacity uh, to create marvelous things, but we also have the capacity to destroy on kind of planetary scales. So I would say like the imperative of human creative freedom, independence, autonomy, that's quite important. I think without that, um, especially non-human flourishing, I think is also endangered. So I would say I'm kind of interested in the prospect of some sort of view. It's like an ecological view. It's ecologically minded. It's kind of computationally informed. But in terms of praxis, to use the lingo, there is some in terms of like kind of pragmatic action. I think that there probably is some kind of uh, I think there's some way in which you can dedicate some serious attention to human affairs and and place quite a bit of responsibility there. Not because it's the only thing that's interesting, but because it's the thing that we can control. Like we don't set policies for animals usually. We set policies for ourselves. And because I think fundamentally, if we don't sort out our own affairs and we don't have people who are kind of independently and autonomously doing creative work, I think that we'll kind of just push ourselves to destroying other things. But here's an interest. I mean, but one thing that does kind of alarm me though is the idea of like if we're going to determine our actions just according to whether or not we think things are interesting, there's something about that that makes me somewhat uneasy, right? So it's like if you say, I find ant colonies interesting, I find coral reefs interesting, I find the behavior of bees interesting, and if enough humans agree, then we'll do things to help preserve and protect these things. But what if there are things that we fundamentally don't understand, or the things we don't know about, or things that haven't been researched enough? How do we have some policy or some kind of stance with some kind of openness towards even things that we personally don't get or not a lot of people know about, or that it has behavior that's not really easy to recognize or appreciate? Because I don't like the idea of the fate of species or ecosystems, et cetera, being dependent on kind of the aesthetic pleasure that we get from knowing about them or studying them. It just seems too. I don't like the fate being dependent on whether or not it kind of piques our interest. That doesn't seem right.
Mm. What other mechanism is there for us to care?
Well, that's the question, right? Which is what? Let's say that you take something and you fundamentally don't really care about it. If we don't really care about it, does that mean that we don't have any responsibility for it? I think that's kind of an interesting question.
Hmm.
Or not that we don't have a responsibility for it, but we can kind of excuse ourselves from behaving in any responsible way with respect to it, or we can kind of justify neglect or harm or something else.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear someone, Richard Łukasz's Nick's thoughts
Yeah.
on this stuff. Because I think James and I could riff forever on this.
Yes, we could.
Well, I don't know. What are the ways to rank rather than by interest? I mean, the problem here is how would you rank it unless you have unlimited resources to preserve everything, right? You have to come up with some kind of sorted order of things. And rather than just pick by interest, I don't know what kind of other criteria you would have to do. Usefulness. How would you define it?
Yeah, I think usefulness will be some kind of second order interest, right?
Yeah.
But my provocation was that maybe you could have this criterion where you use some kind of measure. I mean, some people are there's a relatively big industry of people in consciousness science trying to develop metrics for consciousness, so that you can have scientific, criteria to establish where is ethical or unethical. That is not just based on some kind of, oh yeah, all vertebrates or whatever, and just go on.
But there's something unsettling about even that, which is like, okay, we humans describe ourselves as being conscious, therefore we're going to have ethical commitments to anything that shares that property with us. Like it sounds in principle like it's enlightened, but it's also it could just be like, we're just trying to find some intersection trait-wise with ourselves, and assign some degree to it, and the degree to which it's like us we're going to care about. I mean, it kind of depends on what you want to do. I mean, in response to Nick, right? It's like, yes, you could create some, measure, some kind of, try and quantify the dynamics of different kind of things that you see in the in the environment. Hopefully, you have some understanding of dependencies, so that even if there's something that's fundamentally very simple, like you understand that if you get rid of this, then there'll be some sort of cascade because many things depend on it. I think dependency is probably an important thing. But if it's just a matter of interest, I mean, my fundamental argument is like, as soon as you decide, okay, we're going to eliminate this because it's not interesting, we're going to eliminate this because it is interesting, you can do that, and it's a philosophical framework, but does it have anything to do with like things like justice? If it's based on, human interest and aesthetic pleasure, there's something about it that seems quite abusive. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. Though I don't want to get too sanctimonious about this, because there is also, I mean, nature itself is quite brutal. Like we're always eating things and consuming other organisms, and if you think about it too much, you ultimately will kind of adopt some highly minimalist attitude where you eat almost nothing, and your footprint is quite small. So these questions, I'm not saying these questions are easy. No, I think they're some of the hardest. Yeah.
Seems like we're just beginning to sort of acknowledge the economic pressures that we're putting on each other. I mean, yeah, we can talk about nature, but starting there, that's kind of an acknowledgement to how would it be if we had not done something? How would someone's life or level of suffering be? And starting to kind of acknowledge at least some degree of responsibility as sort of like custodians of the earth that we inhabit. I in a previous life worked in a primate research center in Japan, and bumped into some interesting people there. that's where the cognitive trade-off hypothesis was sort of developed, where they identified regions in the primate brain which were sacrificed for language, which permit these primates to do very fast sort of identification of threats, like large numbers. And they can verify this by exposing them to these lab experiments where they can remember really large sequences of digits in order, which completely like trump a human's ability. We can only do it for some small number, but they can do it for really large numbers. So that's really on the topic of what you mentioned about sort of interest. Like there's a whole resource by sort of studying life, we can learn a lot about ourselves. Not to mention, ecologically, things like ethnobiology or whatever, all of these resources, chemicals, medicines, things that are sort of, being destroyed at an alarming rate. But yeah, this guy I used to work with very briefly. It was called Atsushi Iriki. He's from the Laboratory for Symbolic Cognitive Development, and he has some very interesting things to say. There's a talk of his on YouTube called "The Brain in the Ecosystem: Cognition, Culture, and the Environment," and he had this theory of niche construction, which is like this kind of neural, cognitive, and environment niche construction theory. Yeah, I think there's some interesting things there. And he was very interested in consciousness, the question of consciousness. And he had some experiments where they took, so you have some sort of primates and you have some experiments set up and you're taking data from the system and you construct like a kind of Markov model. And you're able to kind of look at the complexity of these time series that you get from these experiments. And that can tell you something about the information processing that's going on in the brains or as a collective, as a group. It's not just an individual monkeys. And I've got those references here. It's like looking at this sort of Markov dynamics of the state, the way that the state of this collection of biological entities is going through. I found that quite interesting. Then I had some notes here. So like there's an evolutionary pressure to model the world, right, and to reduce uncertainty. But as part of the world, we necessarily change the world. So we have to sort of model, so we have to sort of go to like higher order, like our model of the world and metacognition and so forth, which we seem quite adept at. That seems to be what separates us from other biological entities, is we have this capacity for like metacognition, which is kind of what we're engaging in now in this sort of discussion. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. If you want me to dump those links and the papers and talks by those people, I think.
Yeah, just put them on community fora or Rulia
Cool.
on the Discord.
I'll do that now.
I mean, I guess one other thing in response to what Nick was saying is, I think if you had a nice kind of, I think what Carlos is kind of provoking here is like some sort of a kind of computationally informed, discrete math, dynamic systems informed kind of philosophy of general systems and behaviors that are non-human, and kind of how an appreciation of that could have implications for our behavior. I don't really like the idea of using that as a metric to decide which things we'll destroy, which things we won't. I don't think that that's really the right way of looking at it. I think if you really understood, because the point is understanding the dynamics, it shouldn't just be a way of like, okay, we're going to appreciate this, we're not going to appreciate this. In principle, you should be able to have human societies that are free and creative and prosperous, and certainly use resources from complicated systems that they inhabit, but don't exhaust them. You should be able to make use of resources in perpetuity. This has been done by all peoples for centuries or millennia. We're just particularly bad at the moment in terms of kind of modern globalized logistical system. We're quite bad at creating things that are, that's what this notion of sustainability kind of is ultimately, is you have some appreciation for the dynamics of systems at different scales, and you participate in them, but you don't exhaust them. That's kind of the whole point. So I think there's some way in which this kind of thinking doesn't necessarily have to lead to like this kind of like, okay, what are we going to kill off? What are we going to preserve? In principle, it should allow for us to readopt once again things that, you know, our predecessors knew quite well, just how to live in some sort of system that's greater than that of human activity, where we're functioning and we're living, we can sustain ourselves, and we're eating, and we're constructing habitat, et cetera, but we manage to make still a positive contribution to our environment, and we're not so exacting that we crush the environment that supports us.
I think my point was not so much about deciding what to destroy and what to preserve, but more about how you, because I mean when you say using the environment or even having a positive impact on the environment and so on, I think there are some assumptions that are very widespread and they are fine. Like I share them, but I think for the actual forward-thinking conversation of, you know, projecting civilization into the future and making, you know, thinking, you know, first of all, setting up what is the time scale that we're gonna aim for, or you know, the goals within that time scale and so on. I think what I was proposing is that historically we don't have, and traditionally I guess we don't really have, other than religious belief, we don't have good guidelines on what to attribute value to other than human life, right? Other than human survival and human happiness in some sense, right? And
Wow. Okay, you mean besides religion? So like
besides yeah,
we have
animism,
empathy.
animism,
this kind of-
besides
Yeah,
mystical
right,
belief.
yeah.
I should say mystical beliefs, not religion necessarily. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe, you know, we could have some kind of enlightened animism in the way of having, as I say, some kind of measure that tells you, because I mean, animism is kind of true scientifically, right? Like, I mean, souls seem to be a thing in some kind of way, like minds. I mean, by souls I mean minds, right? These things seem to be real in some kind of sense. I mean, we have some apparently, some other animals do. Some other systems seem to be thinking as well in some capacity, right? And some of them, you know, are very, you know, borderline showing consciousness or self-awareness and all these kinds of things, right? And I think that we probably need a much more, you know, I think it's too naive to say, well, okay, I mean, this thing is alive, we should preserve it. Or, you know, taxonomically we've decided that species are this thing and we're going to count this particular taxon division and we're going to preserve this cardinality for this division. I mean, I think those things are extremely simplistic and they are like 200 years old in some sense, or like 100 years old. And I feel like we need a much more serious, which people are working on, but like as a political conversation, as a social conversation, we need a much more serious consideration of what is life, what is, you know, thought, mind, and what are the things that matter. Because otherwise, you know, in some sense, matter is just doing its thing. You know, the things are flowing, energy is coming in, coming out, and, you know, entropy does its thing, and, you know, here we go. Like, it's in some sense like we're just agents of our causality, right? Like it's nothing that we. In some sense, you can say, well, there's no free will, blah blah blah, and we're just a process, and who cares? But if you're going to care, I think for the conversation to be different than what has been for the last few thousand years, or at least few hundred years of civilization, I think it's important to have this sort of, I don't know, like some kind of enlightened animism where you actually look out for minds, and you don't just attribute minds to what you see, where you can empathically attribute some kind of theory of mind, which is how we've done it historically, but you actually go beyond it and try to, it's a bit like, you know, with alchemy into chemistry, right? This kind of difference. You know, in alchemy, you were looking at the phenomena, but you were thinking of the phenomena in this kind of, you know, superfluous and ad hoc way. And then when you turn that into chemistry, you look at the same phenomena. You're literally doing the same thing in some sense, but now you have a much more universal objectives, a rationalist approach. And this is kind of what I'm suggesting here, that we've done this moral alchemy for a long time, where we basically base our decisions on empathy and kind of like how we relate to it, how we feel about it, how we position ourselves there, and we eventually are going to make decisions based on those feelings and reactions. But my proposal is maybe we should have a more kind of rationally systematic way of charting the mindscape of the world that we're living in. And because I mean that is if you agree that mind and possible thoughts, consciousness, sentience is the relevant variable. Because I mean, some people might say, well, I don't know, some other thing is the relevant variable, and some kind of complexity or some other measure that has nothing to do with mind or thought or sentience or suffering or things like that.
For example, I felt quite sad with the Turkey earthquake. That castle. Obviously, I feel sad for people, but I was surprised at my reaction when I saw this castle that was destroyed. And so, I mean, that's not conscious. That doesn't feel suffering, and yet somehow, it feels like there was a loss and some value there. You know.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it's some. The informational structure needs to be, because if there is no information, almost by definition, you cannot care because there's nothing to care about in some sense, right?
We don't care about mud. We don't care about water.
That's what I mean. It's like if you see like a gas just floating, it's like as long as if we need it, I just need a quantity of it. It's just because there's no more information, right? So this is kind of the cartoon of that is like going to the extreme and saying if there's no information, is this just like some thermal state? Like it's impossible to care other than the state variables of it, like the mass or the volume or the temperature or whatever.
But if things are in abundance and a nuisance, for example, like pests, for example, we don't really care about this. We don't feel much empathy if it's eating all of our crops. We should probably care more about the bees, though, that we're killing with those neonicotinoid pesticides and so forth. But that's kind of a selfish one, though. That's like it's going to directly affect us, so that sort of motivates us to care. Would we care about
what the bee thing?
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's an example where I think okay. On the one hand, you can ask. There's different ways. This comes down to what in philosophy they call axiology. It's like the theory of value, how you actually assign value to things. So, like on the one hand, with the bee question, if you identify some aspect of an ecosystem where there's a very strong dependency, you can make some argument that you have some responsibility to preserve it, not just for yourself, but for all of the dependents. That seems pretty straightforward. You can imagine having some computational or kind of machinic axiology where you have kind of respect for these kind of active biological processes. There's something about them in their own right that you recognize as being important. You recognize, that ultimately we share some sort of animated kind of lineage, not necessarily directly, but this is something that we kind of participate in ourselves. Whether or not you can confirm that, how complicated that's one thing, right? Which is, on the one hand, you can ask questions about how cognitively advanced are particular organisms. That's one thing, right? But then there's also this question of collectively, or even in interface with their environments, how sophisticated is the computation or the kind of machine-like behavior? And when you recognize that, there's something to appreciate. But to Richard's point, and this is the point I was making about things like mountain ranges, etc., there are things that are formed and there's no biological agency whatsoever. It's just kind of
nostalgia or something.
Well, but in the mountain case, it's like something that we've created. So obviously there's some strong information content there potentially. But even with something like a mountain range, it's a process that's relatively inanimate. I don't want to say fully inanimate.
Well, but like when I was under Mount Fuji and saw it for the first time when the clouds parted, I was like, wow. And it's, I suppose it is a system. It has, ecology, weather, etc. If you were to nuke it and completely erase it from existence, then a lot of people might miss that thing.
Yeah, but the value is on, I think the beauty is in the eye of the beholder kind of thing, right? Like
for sure.
it's like the appreciation of that piece of matter is in your stuff, right? Like it's in the matter that makes you, and
Yeah.
and that's kind of what I would try to go, right? Like it's the information that you actually, because I'm the same. Like there are landscapes that I would love to see preserved and to explore again and so on, but I'm very aware that that landscape itself doesn't
It's
have that
in
value.
here,
It's like
yeah.
in my history that I've grown to love that landscape, and you can, I think scientifically you can objectively in the best objective way that we have, you can actually make a distinction between my system of matter and the mountain range system of matter, at least at the scale that is relevant, right? Like you can see how I behave as a history information based agent and the mountain doesn't. Like this is not just a perception. This is a measurement that can be contrasted as good as we are at contrasting those things, right? Because it's obviously a spectrum. It's not like everything is objective and something is subjective, but like I think that's kind of what I'm trying to point at, that we are able to do that distinction. In the past, it was just like, oh yeah, there are spirits everywhere, or this has a spirit, this doesn't have a spirit, this has a very bad spirit, we should kill it definitely. Like that was kind of the criteria. Now it's more like, we have a more scientifically informed way. And we're still very rudimentary, but
less superstition and yeah.
more
I'm now
intersubjectivity,
thinking-
which is the point, I think.
For some reason in my mind, I have this example of you have two files in your computer. One is just a bunch of random bytes, and the other is the network weights for an agent that you fell in love with or something. Now, if you delete both, what's the difference? It's both the same kind of process, but yeah, and I think that kind of speaks to your. It's really the subjective. Yeah.
Because it's a mutual information between the person in love with the agent and the agent, right? You can't, yeah.
A lot of this stuff has been covered in more contemporary philosophy, like even questions of, planets themselves, like having this kind of being these kind of geological computational entities
Sure.
in their own right, which is something that's radically inhuman. And it has really not even that much to do with nature, as we understand it. Like it's not as much about phytomass or zoomass anymore. It's just a matter of kind of this accreted, matter that's kind of
For sure.
kind of come together. So people have thought about that. People have asked questions like, as soon as you start to think of, broader dynamics beyond the planetary, et cetera, how important are humans at all? I mean, these questions do get advanced. I mention it not because I necessarily adopt that point of view, but because people do ask these questions like, as soon as you begin to assign value, I think an easy way to begin is this kind of computationally informed animism. As soon as you extend it outward to geological or astrophysical processes, et cetera, at what point does the human factor not seem important anymore? And people have whole philosophical works about, how in the grand scheme of things, even kind of computationally, I guess, humans are maybe not that important. But if you adopt that point of view, then nothing really has any importance, because aside from maybe the kind of filaments in these large galaxy clusters or anything, but if you go to higher and higher scales, things just get dwarfed by larger and larger objects. I tend not to be someone who thinks that scale really matters here.
I don't think scale matters that much.
I don't think scale matters that much.
Actually, on your comment about planets, I think one of the, maybe not so much on the philosophy front, but on the biology front, a lot of the people who are very seriously working on the origin of life and some of the, like, I would say more promising lines of research on origin of life currently actually think of planets as the geological conditions, the geochemistry of planets as really kind of the systems that we need to be thinking about. Because, I mean, obviously, unless something really weird, perhaps not completely impossible, but weird happened, like, completely some kind of a weird event that is, some quantum fluctuation went wrong or whatever. Unless something like that happened, we know for sure that it was the accreted mass of the Earth that that eventually gave rise to the conditions for life to develop, right? Even if it appeared somewhere else, it was probably something like that, right? So thinking of planets, and when you think of planet Earth in particular, I think it's quite. I mean, sometimes I've just been around, like walking in nature, and you think. To me, this comes kind of intuitively that you see the Earth is like this. Essentially, on average, it's like a ball of lava, right? Like on average, right? And then, but it has this thin crust, right? From the vacuum of space, where it's like emptiness, like almost literal emptiness, right? And then inside is like some blob of molten stuff. It's super hot, right? And then you have this very thin, super thin crust, where you have a flow of energy that is like dissipating very slowly the inner temperature and getting the sun radiation, right? And so it has this very, and it's perfectly like in the green zone of like liquid water, and all this chemistry that can happen, the carbon chemistry that can happen in this range of like about 50 degrees, right, more or less, and like Celsius, right? So you have this, as a kind of it's like the foam on top of the ocean. Like there's a massive thing that is like blob in one side, high temperature, blob of nothingness in the other, and you have this very thin crust where all this like bubbling stuff happens, and then eventually life appears and all this kind of stuff. But there is much larger context of, if you don't get that very thin sort of like pocket of regime of chemistry, nothing like that is going to develop, because it's either going to be way too hot or way too cold, and thermodynamically. So I think that's kind of a perspective that a lot of people are beginning to take much more seriously, and scientifically it's kind of a given now. Like nobody really questions that. Of course, you need that kind of situation, but that's just a kind of almost astrophysical condition. It's nothing to do with information in principle. It's nothing to do with like computation or cognition or anything like that, or like information dynamics. The point is that it probably gives rise to information dynamics in a very interesting way, and that's probably the way to identify which such planets, such astrophysical conditions eventually give rise to life or something like that. And that's the problem to solve. That's what I find so fascinating. But yeah, for sure. I mean, those units are... and then, of course, there's the question of cosmic entities, which is what we're talking about offline the other day among ourselves, the fellows, because you could think, okay, so we know that thin crusts of rocky planets have led to life, or some kind of information dynamics, that genetics and blah blah blah. What about other systems, right? What if, I don't know, some of the phases of the sun, of some stars, have like the relative concentrations of metals, that are accreting and like doing some kind of, maybe even like nuclear reactions mixed with chemical reactions or whatever, like in plasma dynamics, like whatever, so that it develops similarly complicated and information dynamics, right? If it has to be stable enough, it has to be some kind of like reproducing enough and self-replicating enough and blah blah. And but people have hypothesized this kind of beings of like non-chemical forms of life and things like that, right? Which we know can kind of exist because we've created them with technology. So it's this is the cosmic entity kind of direction of the conversation, where you start to think of like big clouds that travel the universe and are somehow conscious because they have all this information inside, and becomes like scientific deities. But yeah. It's very fascinating stuff. By the way, do we want to address the one question that was posted before we close? Or someone wanted...
Well, does anyone else have anything to say?
I was going to say,
Carlos
if
said
you want to add something else, please go ahead.
I would say don't discount the value of like the geomagnetic field. So without that, this thin crust would be kind of useless.
Yeah.
And not to subtract from your point. I think it's still very interesting. It's just, you know, and actually this thing that we raised when we were discussing life existing in other forms was actually the electromagnetic field, that some sort of higher order structures could emerge there and you know, create some dynamics which end up looking sort of biological, or at least have some kind of persistence that you know, like in Game of Life, allows for these higher order structures to emerge and create a substrate for computation.
Exactly, yes, absolutely, for computation. I think that's the key. You know, if you have some kind of informational dynamics or some kind of replicability and memory, you know, when memory starts to become a powerful descriptor, I think that's, you know, a signature that something is going on, right?
According to what's his name, and this is kind of a bit out there, and I don't think there's much to support it, substantiate it, but I don't know if you know, Rupert Sheldrake has this theory that, you know, as soon as something that you know, as soon as like a new crystal is synthesized, it apparently kind of happens quicker, you know, and it's on the realms of sort of like pseudoscience. He had this idea of this morphogenetic field, which is that as soon as life sort of creates a certain form, it can kind of do so with a slight increase of ease the next time around. And there's evidence for this, but nobody can really explain why it happens in this sort of non-local way.
Yeah, the crystal formation, for example, right?
Yeah, that was one example he's given, and there's a few other things like lab experiments, like if you expose like mice to certain types of mazes, then all of a sudden around the Earth they actually solve them quicker and things like that. And it's kind of nuts, and I'm very skeptical. It's not the kind of thing that I just listen to and think, oh yeah. And
Sure, no, absolutely.
actually, his TED talk was taken down, and somebody stabbed him. So it's a bit like what's his name? It's
That's
like
a bit too
Rushdie. Yeah, someone was so offended by his.
Okay.
his
That's
claims
that's the harshest caveat I've ever heard. You explain someone's theory, and you say, "Okay,
way-
yes, I explain this person's theory, but I don't necessarily believe it. In fact, someone stabbed him."
Someone was so offended by his claims that they. I mean, it's kind of probably along the same lines of what happened with Salman Rushdie. But anyway, if there is any kind of truth to that, then it's sort of, you know, there maybe is some kind of. You just mentioned memory, and it made me think that, you know, perhaps there are these effects that we're not really aware of, that, and it's specifically to do with form. It's like if something forms, then actually I had thoughts about this related to when Stephen was talking about like fractional dimensional space, and in fractional order dynamical systems they have two things. They have non-locality and memory. So things like non-Newtonian fluids or anything that's modeled by a sort of dynamical system with a fractional order in one of the terms exhibits these properties of non-locality and the memory effect. And if, you know, if our sort of theory of physics necessitates these sort of fractional dimensions and the fact that they can fluctuate throughout space, then perhaps there is some kind of anyway, maybe I'm going down the sort of pseudoscience route with that, but those are my thoughts on memory.
I think locality is not a feature of fractional dimension. I think there's many definitions of a fractional derivative, for example. I think there are definitions that are purely local. So I think you can build up some fractional calculus without non-locality. Okay. Probably.
I'll stick it in the Discord, but basically, I mean, we've got here fractional calculus, non-locality, and memory effects.
But there's distinction between like fractional order derivative and like first order derivative and like fractal space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they are related. Actually, I found a reference which sort of relates the fractionality of like spatial dimensions and the order of the dynamical system being fractional. It's a reference that I put in the chat many times when I was on the outside of things, but yeah. I can't paste links in the community for a channel, so somebody needs to change some permissions on the. I can paste videos, but not links.
You have
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, maybe we should address that question if we have time.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just, one last thing on this. I mean, first of all, this is really quite an interesting challenge that Carlos has presented to us. We could chat about this for, well, maybe just indefinitely. I will say that I think people are thinking about this in the humanities and philosophy. There are a lot of, I mean, this is like a key question people are trying to grapple with, which is like the relationship between humans and their environment and broader processes and what constitutes life, what doesn't constitute life. The only challenge is that I don't think there's been proper interface between the people who are doing that work and people who study computation or have a quantitative approach. And the question, but it becomes challenging because it's not as though the quantitative approach solves all the philosophical dilemmas. But what I think it would do is it would allow people to frame their arguments in kind of more precise ways, and then once all these different arguments are framed more precisely, perhaps by communicating them through a common formal medium, like using mathematics or computer science, et cetera, that it could be possible to kind of reconcile some of these things. That's like a general hope that I have, which is in humanities, philosophy, social theory, etc. There's no poverty of ideas. People have many really interesting ideas. There's a lot of bright people working on these things. But in the end, it's one person's polemic versus another person's polemic. It's one person's kind of poetic description versus another person's poetic description. And these things don't get synthesized easily at all. So hopefully, taking these quite challenging philosophical questions and making them more quantitative, it could actually allow for synthesis that you wouldn't see otherwise because you're putting it into a kind of a common currency. So I do see some promise there. But my only kind of recommendation is there's a lot of new things that one could do as soon as one really tries to make precise how you're going to frame things, like if you're going to frame them in terms of computation or information, et cetera. So there's a lot that could be done there. But you're not philosophically, we're not reinventing the wheel, or at least we shouldn't, because people, there are serious people who think about this, and there's a pretty serious body of literature on it. But yeah. Okay. What was the question that they got? They got a question.
I was thinking that given that we just hit the hour, I will probably keep that for next week because it's mathematics and the Rulliad, so it's really changing gears. So instead of giving a partial, relatively short answer, we could bring it next week and maybe contextualize it a bit better. Because I mean, it's an interesting question, I guess. I mean, it goes back to some of our earlier discussions about computational time and time complexity versus term complexity and things like that. And so we could just save it for next week. And also
sure. Okay.
Create the carrot for next week.
Yeah, because it would be quite a jump between from this to the next thing. Not that we haven't had jumps before, but yeah, maybe we should cut it here. Well, yeah, we didn't know what we would chat about, and in the end, we just chatted about one thing. But that yeah,
It was very fun. Enjoyed it.
Yeah. I always like Carlos's. I won't say rants, but I always like it when we find something that Carlos is really excited about, because he has a lot. He usually has a lot to say. So that was nice.
That was nice. Yep. So can we stay briefly after this for a couple logistic things?
Sure.
All right. So should we end the stream here?
Sure. Thanks everyone for listening, and if you violently disagree or agree or what with anything that's been said,
then don't stab us.
There's some
the
means of distraction. No, wait. Was that him? No, Anders in the chat when Richard said that Speldrake got stabbed, said, so someone took a stab at him literally. That was quite beautiful. So yeah, thank you everyone in chat. Good to see you. We'll be back
Yeah,
tomorrow
thanks.
with more research-related
Thanks.
stuff.
Yeah. Well, yeah. All right. See you guys tomorrow, and and feel free to chat in the Discord about anything that we brought up today or things relevant. Yeah.
Indeed.
Cheers.
See you soon.
Bye.